The morning of my husband's funeral, I woke up with the strange sensation that I had already said goodbye to him months ago. Richard had been dying slowly for 2 years. Cancer has a way of making you mourn someone while they're still breathing. I expected tears. I expected emptiness. But what I didn't expect was discovering that the man I'd buried my heart with had been living an entirely different life. My name is Elena, and I'm 68 years old. For 40 years, I believed I knew everything about my marriage. I was wrong. The funeral parlor smelled like lilies and floor wax, that suffocating combination that follows death wherever it goes. I sat in the front row wearing the black dress I'd bought 3 months earlier, when we all knew Richard wouldn't see Christmas. My son Marcus sat beside me, his hand occasionally touching my shoulder in those brief, obligatory gestures of comfort that felt more like checking off boxes than genuine affection. Behind us, maybe 30 people had gathered, Richard's work colleagues, a few neighbors, some distant relatives who appeared at family events like seasonal decorations. Nothing unusual, nothing that prepared me for what came next. She walked in just as the service was beginning, young, maybe 35, with auburn hair pulled into a respectful bun and a black dress that looked expensive. I'd seen her before. She'd been Richard's caregiver these past 6 months, the woman the hospice agency had recommended when I couldn't manage his care alone anymore. Sarah, I think her name was. She'd been professional, efficient, and I'd been grateful for her help during those awful final weeks. What struck me as odd was how she seated herself in the third row, not with the medical staff or toward the back like other service providers might. She sat like family. And when I glanced back during the opening hymn, I saw something that made my stomach clench. She was crying with the desperate, throat-closing sobs of someone who'd lost a lover, not a patient. The service passed in a blur of generic condolences and readings from Ecclesiastes. I found myself watching Sarah more than listening to the pastor. The way she dabbed her eyes wasn't the professional sympathy of a caregiver. This was raw grief, the kind that comes from loving someone and losing them. After the burial, while people clustered around the graveside, making those uncomfortable small-talk conversations that happen at funerals, I excused myself to get some air. The reception was being held at our church hall, but I needed a moment alone before facing another hour of sorry for your loss and awkward stories about Richard that I'd heard a dozen times before. I was walking back toward my car when I heard voices coming from behind the maintenance shed, just out of sight from the main gathering. One was Marcus. I'd recognize my son's voice anywhere. The other was a woman's voice, soft and familiar. I know this is difficult, Marcus was saying, but we have to be careful about timing. I can't pretend anymore, the woman replied, and I realized it was Sarah. It's been 6 months of pretending, Marcus. 6 months of acting like I was just his caregiver while you and I stopped walking. Actually stopped breathing. My mother can't know, Marcus continued. Not yet. She's dealing with enough right now. When things settle down, when some time has passed, then we can figure out what to tell her. There was a long pause, and then Sarah's voice again, smaller now. He promised me, Marcus. Before he died, your father promised he'd taken care of everything. The will, the house. He said I wouldn't have to worry. And you won't, Marcus said. But we have to be smart about this. She's going to contest anything that looks suspicious. We wait a few months, let the legal stuff process, and then, if you like emotional stories like this one, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here on our channel. And tell me, from which city are you watching this unfold? I stood there behind a oak tree, my hand pressed against the bark so hard I could feel it leaving marks on my palm. My son, my only child, was having an affair with my husband's caregiver, the woman who had been in our home every day, who had bathed my dying husband and fed him soup and held his hand while I went to the grocery store or tried to get a few hours of sleep. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the conversation about wills and houses and legal proceedings, about promises Richard had made to this woman, about keeping secrets from me due his wife of 40 years, until the legal stuff could be sorted out. I felt something break inside my chest, but it wasn't my heart. Hearts break cleanly, with sharp edges and dramatic finality. This was different. This was the slow crumbling of everything I'd built my identity around, the gradual erosion of a foundation I'd never thought to question. I backed away from the tree, careful not to make any noise, and walked to my car on legs that felt disconnected from my body. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the gathering of mourners who were slowly making their way to their vehicles, ready to continue their lives now that they'd paid their respects to mine. Marcus appeared at my passenger window, tapping gently. I rolled it down. "Mom, are you all right? You missed the reception?" I looked at my son, really looked at him. When had his face become so calculating? When had he learned to arrange his features into expressions of concern that didn't reach his eyes? "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired. I think I'll go home. Do you want me to follow you? Make sure you get there safely?" Such consideration, such thoughtfulness, such perfect performance of the devoted son. "No," I said. "I'll be fine on my own." He nodded and stepped back from the car, and I drove home to the house where I'd lived for 25 years. The house where I'd raised Marcus and nursed Richard, and built what I'd thought was a life that mattered to someone. The house felt different that evening. Not empty, exactly, but hollow. Like a stage set after the play has ended and the audience has gone home. I walked through rooms that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else, looking at photographs and furniture, and accumulated memories that had somehow become evidence of a life I'd apparently never really understood. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where Richard and I had eaten breakfast together for decades, where Marcus had done his homework as a child, where we'd played board games on rainy Sunday afternoons, where I'd planned birthday parties and Christmas dinners, and all the small celebrations that mark a family's passage through time. Now I understood that while I'd been living in that kitchen, in that house, in that marriage, other people had been living entirely different lives right beside me. Lives with secrets and promises and plans that didn't include me except as an obstacle to be managed. The tea grew cold while I sat there, trying to reconstruct the past 6 months. Every interaction with Sarah took on new meaning. Every private conversation between her and Richard that I'd walked in on and politely backed away from. Every time Marcus had visited during those final weeks and spent more time talking to the caregiver than comforting his dying father. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would come later, along with hurt and betrayal, and all the other emotions that surface when you discover your life has been built on shifting sand. But that first night, sitting alone in my kitchen with cold tea and the echo of overheard conversations, I felt something much quieter and more dangerous. I felt the beginning of clarity. The days following Richard's funeral passed like scenes from someone else's life. Marcus called every morning at exactly 9 o'clock, not to check on my emotional well-being, I realized, but to monitor what I might be doing, what I might be discovering. "How are you holding up, Mom?" he'd ask, his voice carrying that practiced concern that sounded increasingly hollow each time I heard it. "I'm managing," I'd tell him, which was true in the most basic sense. I was eating, sleeping, going through the motions of widowhood that everyone expected. What I didn't tell him was that I was also listening, really listening, for the first time in years, to the spaces between his words, to the things he wasn't saying, to the careful way he steered every conversation away from anything that mattered. "Have you thought about what you want to do with Dad's things?" he asked on the third day. "His clothes? His office stuff? I could come over this weekend and help you sort through everything." Such eagerness to help. Such sudden interest in being involved in the practical details of grief. I wondered what he was really looking for, what papers or documents he needed to find before I stumbled across them myself. "Not yet," I said. "It's too soon." I could hear his frustration in the pause that followed. "Mom, I know it's hard, but putting it off isn't going to make it easier. These things need to be dealt with eventually." "Eventually," I agreed, "but not this week." Another pause. Maybe Sarah could help. She knew where Dad kept everything, and she's been through this before, with other families. Sarah. He mentioned her name with such casual precision, like he'd been practicing how to work her into conversations naturally, like he'd been preparing for this moment when he'd need to position her as a helpful resource, rather than what she actually was, the woman who'd been sleeping with my husband while I paid her salary. "I'll think about it," I said, which was becoming my standard response to anything Marcus suggested. After we hung up, I found myself walking through the house differently, seeing it through new eyes. Richard's study, where he'd spent his final months when moving around became difficult, suddenly felt like a crime scene. How many times had Sarah been in there with the door closed while I was in the kitchen making lunch or doing laundry? How many intimate conversations had happened in that room while I puttered around the house, grateful that my dying husband had someone competent to help him with his needs? The irony was sharp enough to cut. I'd been paying for my own betrayal, writing checks every 2 weeks to the woman who was stealing my husband's affections and apparently his financial promises as well. I started paying attention to things I'd previously overlooked, the way Marcus had begun visiting more frequently in Richard's final months, but always when Sarah was there, how he'd taken to having long conversations with her in the hallway, voices too low for me to overhear from the kitchen, the way she'd sometimes answered Richard's phone when I called from the grocery store, as if she belonged there more than I did. "Mrs. Morrison," she'd say when I called, her voice warm but somehow possessive. "He's resting right now. Should I have him call you back?" I'd thought she was being considerate. Now I understood she was managing access to my own husband, controlling when and how I could speak to him in his final weeks. The pieces were falling into place with nauseating clarity, but I still wasn't ready to confront anyone. Instead, I began my own quiet investigation. I started with Richard's desk, the big oak piece that had been his command center for our entire marriage. He'd always been particular about his papers, everything filed and organized with the precision of someone who'd spent his career in accounting. But when I finally worked up the courage to look through his files, I found gaps, empty folders labeled things like insurance, life, and estate planning, and investment accounts. Someone had been through these files recently, someone who knew exactly what to look for and what to take. I called our lawyer, Martin Webb, a man who'd handled our wills and property transfers and various legal matters for nearly 20 years. Martin had known Richard since college. If anyone would tell me the truth about what had been happening, it would be him. "Elena," he said when his secretary put me through, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Richard was a good man." "Thank you, Martin. I'm calling because I need to understand some things about Richard's affairs. The will, the estate planning. I'm having trouble finding the paperwork." There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Elena, didn't Marcus speak with you about this? Richard asked me to make sure you were both informed about the changes he made." Changes. The word hit me like a physical blow. "What changes, Martin?" Another pause, longer this time. "Elena, I think it would be better if we discussed this in person. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" That night, I called Marcus. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't wait for his morning check-in call. I needed to hear his voice when I asked him directly about what Martin had mentioned. "Mom?" He sounded surprised, maybe even worried. "Is everything all right?" "I spoke with Martin Webb today," I said without preamble. "He mentioned that your father made some changes to his will, changes that you apparently knew about." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Mom," Marcus finally said, his voice careful and measured, "Dad wanted to make sure you were taken care of. Everything he did was with your best interests in mind." "That's not what I asked, Marcus. I asked if you knew about changes to his will." "Yes," he said finally. "I knew." "And you didn't think to mention this to me? At the funeral? In any of our conversations this week?" "We didn't want to add to your stress. There's time to deal with all of this later, when you're feeling stronger." "We." He said "we" without thinking. And that single word told me everything I needed to know about how decisions were being made about my life, my future, my husband's legacy. "Who is we, Marcus?" Another pause. "Mom, let's talk about this when you've had some time to process everything. Grief makes everything feel more complicated than it needs to be." He was managing me. My own son was using the same tone he might use with a confused elderly person who couldn't be trusted to understand complex information. The dismissiveness in his voice was like a slap. "I'm not confused, Marcus. And I'm not too grief-stricken to understand that people have been making decisions about my life without including me in the conversation." "That's not what happened, ah? Then tell me what did happen. Tell me about these changes your father made. Tell me why Martin Webb thinks you should have informed me about them already." The pause this time felt different. Not hesitation, but calculation. I could almost hear him weighing his options, deciding how much truth he could afford to give me without revealing too much. "Dad revised some of his estate planning in his final months," Marcus said finally. "He wanted to make sure certain people who'd been important to him were taken care of." "It doesn't change your security, Mom. The house is still yours. You'll still have your income." But he felt obligations to others. Others. Such a careful, neutral word for the woman who'd been sleeping with my husband while I trusted her to provide his care. "Sarah," I said. "Yes," he admitted. "Sarah. And you think this is appropriate? You think your father should have been making financial arrangements for his caregiver without discussing it with his wife? Mom, I think Dad made the decisions he felt were right, and I think we should respect that. The conversation ended shortly after that, with Marcus promising to explain everything when we met with Martin Webb the next day. But I already understood enough. My husband had died loving someone else. My son had watched it happen and said nothing. And now they expected me to quietly accept whatever arrangements had been made for my future, while they sorted out how to divide up the remains of my life. That night, for the first time since Richard's death, I cried. Not for my husband, though. I'd already mourned him months ago when the cancer began stealing him away piece by piece. I cried for the woman I'd been just a week earlier, the woman who'd believed her marriage was solid, her son was loyal, and her life had meaning beyond what others decided to grant her. I cried for my own naive trust, for the decades I'd spent building something I'd thought was permanent, for the comfortable illusions that had just been stripped away to reveal a reality I'd never suspected. But even as I cried, I felt something harder taking root beneath the sadness, something that felt like the beginning of anger, or maybe just the first stirrings of self-respect I'd felt in longer than I cared to admit. Tomorrow, I would sit in Martin Webb's office and learn the details of how my life had been reorganized without my consent. Tomorrow, I would discover exactly how little my 40 years of marriage had counted when the final accounting was made. But tonight, for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely awake. Martin Webb's office felt like a courtroom where I was both defendant and victim, facing charges I didn't understand for crimes I hadn't committed. The mahogany conference table gleamed under fluorescent lights, and Marcus sat across from me with the composed expression of someone who'd already heard everything that was about to destroy my world. Martin opened a thick folder and pulled out documents that looked official and final. Elena, before we begin, I want you to know that Richard spent considerable time thinking about these decisions. He wasn't acting impulsively. I folded my hands in my lap and waited, because what else could I do? The house remains yours, as does Richard's pension and Social Security survivor benefits, Martin continued, reading from papers I'd never seen before. However, Richard established a separate trust for Sarah Mitchell, funded by his life insurance policy and a portion of his investment accounts. The numbers he read felt abstract, disconnected from reality. $200,000 to a woman who'd known my husband for 6 months. Half of our investment portfolio, money we'd saved together for 40 years, transferred to someone who'd been paid to care for him while I worked second shifts at the hospital to help cover his medical expenses. There's also a provision for the lake house, Martin said, his voice growing quieter. The lake house, our weekend retreat for 25 years, where Marcus had learned to fish, where Richard and I had celebrated our anniversaries, where I'd imagined spending my retirement years reading on the porch and watching seasons change over the water. Sarah will have lifetime use of the property, with ownership transferring to Marcus upon her death. I stared at Martin, then at Marcus, waiting for someone to explain how this made sense, how a dying man could give away our shared memories to someone who'd entered our lives when it was nearly over. She's been taking care of the property, Marcus said, as if that justified anything. Dad was worried about it sitting empty, deteriorating. This way someone who cares about the place will maintain it properly. Cares about the place. As if I, who'd spent decades planting gardens there, painting shutters, hosting family gatherings, didn't care about our sanctuary because I'd been too busy nursing my dying husband to drive up there every weekend. I need some time to process this, I said finally. Of course, Martin replied. But, Elena, you should know that Richard was very specific about his wishes. He felt that Sarah had sacrificed a great deal to care for him, and he wanted to ensure her future was secure. After leaving Martin's office, I drove aimlessly through neighborhoods I'd known for decades, trying to reconcile the man who'd made these decisions with the husband I thought I'd been married to. Eventually, I found myself at the grocery store where Richard and I had shopped together every Saturday morning for years, wandering the aisles because I needed to be somewhere familiar while my world reorganized itself around this new reality. I was standing in the produce section, staring at tomatoes I didn't need, when I heard Sarah's voice behind me. Mrs. Morrison? Elena? I turned to find her approaching with a shopping cart and that same professional smile she'd worn in our house for 6 months. Today she looked different, less like a caregiver and more like a young woman who belonged in the world. who had places to go and people to see, and a future that had been suddenly, generously funded. "I wanted to thank you," she said, stopping her cart next to mine, "for being so understanding about everything. I know this situation is difficult. Understanding. As if I'd been consulted. As if I'd had any choice in being understanding about my husband's final betrayal. Richard spoke about you often in his last weeks," she continued, apparently interpreting my silence as invitation to keep talking. "He worried about how you'd handle everything. He really did love you, you know." The casual way she said it, "He really did love you," like she was offering me comfort about a relationship she'd observed from the outside, rather than the marriage she'd helped destroy from within. "Thank you," I managed. "Because what else do you say when someone offers sympathy for your loss while wearing jewelry your husband probably bought her?" "I hope we can maintain a friendship," Sarah said. "Richard would have wanted that. And Marcus, well, Marcus has been such a help during this transition." The way she said his name, with that slight softening of her voice, confirmed what I'd already suspected. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about my son choosing sides, and those sides didn't include me. "I should let you finish your shopping," I said, pushing my cart away from hers. "Elena," she called after me, "if you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to ask. I know how overwhelming all of this must feel." I left my cart in the aisle and walked out of the store, sitting in my car in the parking lot until I could breathe normally again. The presumption of it, the woman who'd been stealing my husband's affections offering to help me cope with losing him. The casual assumption that I should be grateful for her understanding, her willingness to maintain a friendship with the woman she'd deceived for months. That evening, Marcus called as usual, but this time his tone was different, more confident, less careful. "How did the meeting go?" he asked, though obviously he already knew. "It was enlightening," I said. "Mom, I know some of this seems unfair, but Dad wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. The medication, the pain, it affects judgment. Sarah was very persuasive when he was vulnerable. It took me a moment to understand what he was suggesting, that my husband had been manipulated, taken advantage of, essentially victimized by a scheming caregiver who'd exploited his weakness for financial gain. It was almost believable, except for one problem. It didn't explain Marcus's enthusiastic cooperation with arrangements that supposedly resulted from Richard's compromised judgment. "If you thought your father was being manipulated," I said carefully, "why didn't you do something to stop it?" "I tried, Mom. But you know how stubborn he could be. And legally there wasn't much I could do. A person has the right to distribute their assets however they choose, even if their family disagrees with those choices." Such legal expertise. Such understanding of what could and couldn't be challenged, almost as if he'd researched the topic thoroughly, prepared for questions about his failure to protect his father's interests, or mine. "I ran into Sarah at the grocery store today," I said. "Oh?" His voice sharpened slightly. "How did that go?" "She offered her friendship. Said she hoped we could maintain a relationship because it's what your father would have wanted. That was thoughtful of her. She also mentioned that you've been helpful during her transition." Another pause. "Mom, she's dealing with a lot right now, too. Dad's death affected her deeply. She's basically starting over, and I've just tried to be supportive." Supportive. Such a generous word for whatever had been happening between my son and my husband's caregiver. Such a kind interpretation of relationships that had apparently been developing while I'd been focused on my dying husband's medical needs. "Marcus," I said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course. Are you involved with Sarah romantically?" The silence that followed was answer enough, but he eventually spoke. "Mom, I know how this looks. I know the timing seems terrible, but sometimes life doesn't follow the schedule we'd prefer. Sarah and we connected during a very difficult time. We were both dealing with Dad's illness, both trying to help him, and both sleeping together while I was paying her to care for my dying husband. It wasn't like that. It started after. It developed gradually, and we both fought it because we knew how complicated it was. But feelings aren't something you can just turn off. Feelings. As if love justified any amount of deception, any level of betrayal. As if having feelings excused the months of lies, the secret meetings, the financial arrangements made behind my back. "How long?" I asked. "Mom, how long, Marcus?" 3 months, he said finally. "Maybe 4. 4 months. While I'd been sleeping in the guest room because Richard's medical equipment took up most of our bedroom, my son had been sleeping with the woman I'd hired to help us through the worst period of our lives. While I'd been working extra shifts to pay for care that insurance didn't cover, that care provider had been conducting an affair with my son in my own house. "I need some time," I said. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're all trying to figure out how to move forward. Dad is gone, but the rest of us still have lives to live. The rest of us. Not me, apparently. The rest of them, Marcus and Sarah and whatever future they were planning with my husband's money, and my husband's property, and my husband's son." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and tried to remember when I'd last felt like I mattered to anyone, when I'd last had a conversation with my son that didn't feel like negotiation or management, when I'd last been included in decisions about my own life instead of being presented with fate's accomplice that I was expected to accept gracefully. I made myself dinner, a simple omelet that I ate standing at the counter because sitting at the table felt too formal for one person, too much like pretending I still had a life that deserved proper meals and meaningful routines. The phone rang while I was washing dishes. It was Sarah. "Elena, I hope you don't mind me calling. Marcus gave me your number. I wanted to follow up on our conversation today." I dried my hands slowly, wondering what follow-up was needed for an encounter I'd tried to end as quickly as possible. "I've been thinking about what you must be going through," she continued, "and I realize I haven't been as sensitive as I should have been. Losing Richard was devastating for me, but I know it must be even harder for you. Even harder for me." The woman who'd stolen my husband's final months was acknowledging that losing him might be slightly more difficult for his wife than for his caregiver. "I was wondering if you'd like to have coffee sometime," Sarah said. "I have so many beautiful memories of Richard's last weeks, stories about things he said and did that you might find comforting. I'd love to share them with you." She wanted to have coffee, to share memories, to comfort me with stories about my husband's final weeks that she'd experienced while I'd been working to pay her salary. "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I don't think that would be appropriate." "Oh," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. "I just thought Marcus suggested it might be healing for both of us." Marcus had suggested it. Of course he had. Another attempt to manage the situation, to normalize relationships that could never be normal, to make me complicit in accepting arrangements I'd had no part in creating. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'm not ready for that kind of conversation." "I understand," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't understand at all. "But Elena, I hope you know that I never intended for any of this to hurt you. What happened between Richard and me, it wasn't planned. It just developed naturally, and he seemed so much happier in his final months. I like to think I gave him some joy during a very difficult time. What happened between Richard and me?" She said it so casually, so matter-of-factly, as if adultery was just something that happened like weather or traffic, beyond anyone's control or responsibility. After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen and realized that everyone in my life was now working from the same script. The grief-stricken widow who needed to be managed, protected from too much truth too quickly, guided toward acceptance of realities other people had created. But I wasn't grieving anymore. I was awake, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I was paying attention to exactly how little my feelings, my opinions, and my preferences seemed to matter to the people who claimed to care about my well-being. The weeks that followed felt like living underwater, everything muffled and distant, movements slow and deliberate. I stopped answering Marcus's daily calls, letting them go to voicemail where his voice grew increasingly irritated with my unavailability. I stopped going to the grocery store where I might encounter Sarah with her sympathetic smiles and generous offers of friendship. I even stopped attending the weekly bridge game I'd enjoyed for 15 years, because I couldn't bear the thought of explaining my situation to women who'd known Richard and me as a couple. Instead, I developed new routines that required no interaction with anyone who'd known me as half of something larger. I shopped at a different grocery store across town, one where the clerks didn't know my name or my history. I took walks at dawn when the neighborhood was empty except for joggers who were too focused on their own goals to notice an older woman moving quietly through their peripheral vision. My house, which had once felt warm and lived in, began to echo with the hollow sounds that develop when spaces are occupied by someone who's given up pretending to have a purpose. I ate simple meals standing at the kitchen counter, reading yesterday's newspaper because today's news felt irrelevant to a life that had apparently already been decided by other people. I watered plants because they needed water, not because I cared whether they lived or died. The mailbox became a daily reminder of my new irrelevance. Bills addressed to Richard continued arriving for months after his death, and I dutifully forwarded them to Marcus, who'd taken over managing what he called Dad's remaining obligations. But increasingly, I received mail that wasn't addressed to me at all. Bank statements and legal documents and insurance correspondence that went directly to the post office box Marcus had established for estate business. Even my own mail felt like correspondence meant for someone else. Condolence cards from people who'd heard about Richard's death, written to a grieving widow who deserved sympathy for losing a devoted husband. Invitations to social events from friends who still thought of me as part of a couple. People who didn't know that my membership in their social circle had been revoked along with everything else I'd taken for granted. I tried briefly to maintain the friendships that had sustained me through previous difficulties. But conversations with women who'd known Richard and me for decades became exercises in careful editing, omitting the details that would require too much explanation or generate too much pity. How do you tell people that your husband left most of his assets to his caregiver without sounding like a woman who'd failed to pay attention to her own life? Margaret Chen, my closest friend since our children were small, invited me to lunch 3 weeks after the funeral. We'd maintained our friendship through divorces and job losses and health scares, supporting each other through the various crises that mark middle age. But sitting across from her in the restaurant where we'd celebrated promotions and commiserated over disappointments, I realized I couldn't access the woman she'd been friends with for 20 years. "You look tired," Margaret said, studying my face with the concern of someone who'd seen me through Richard's illness and expected me to begin recovering now that his suffering was over. "Are you sleeping?" "Some," I said, which was true. I slept in fragments, waking at 3 in the morning to remember conversations with Sarah, replaying Marcus's explanations, trying to identify the exact moment when my life had been reorganized without my consent. "Have you thought about traveling? Maybe visiting your sister in Phoenix? Getting away from the house and all the memories for a while?" Such practical advice, the kind of suggestion friends make when they believe grief follows predictable patterns that can be managed through sensible choices. But Margaret didn't know that my grief wasn't for Richard. It was for the woman I'd been before I understood how completely invisible I'd become. "I'm not ready to travel," I said. "What about the house? It's awfully big for one person. Have you considered downsizing? Maybe something smaller, easier to maintain?" She meant well, but her questions felt like pressure to make decisions that would further diminish my footprint in the world. Sell the house where I'd raised my son, where I'd cared for my dying husband, where I'd built the only stability I'd ever known. Move somewhere smaller, more appropriate for a woman whose usefulness had expired along with her marriage. "I'm comfortable where I am," I said. The conversation limped along for another hour, touching on safe topics, her grandchildren's activities, neighborhood changes, mutual acquaintances who'd remarried or moved away. But underneath our careful politeness, I sensed Margaret's growing frustration with my responses, her concern transforming into something that felt like impatience with my failure to bounce back according to the timeline she expected. When we parted in the parking lot, she hugged me tighter than usual. "Elena, I'm worried about you. You seem distant, disconnected. Maybe you should talk to someone professional. Grief counseling might help." Professional help. Another suggestion that my reactions were symptoms to be treated rather than reasonable responses to discovering that my entire adult life had been built on false assumptions. As if therapy could restore my faith in relationships that had revealed themselves to be performances, contracts that could be voided without my signature. I stopped returning Margaret's calls after that lunch, not from anger, but from exhaustion. Maintaining friendships required energy I no longer possessed, pretending to be someone I no longer was. It felt easier to let those relationships fade than to explain why I could no longer access the woman they'd known. The house grew quieter as I eliminated activities that required interaction with the outside world. I canceled the cleaning service that had helped me maintain our large home during Richard's illness, partly to save money, but mostly to avoid the awkwardness of explaining why rooms that had once been occupied by 2 people now showed so little evidence of life being lived. I stopped attending church, where well-meaning congregants asked after my health and offered assistance I didn't want. I declined invitations to book club meetings, neighborhood potlucks, and volunteer activities that had once provided structure and purpose to my weeks. Each declined invitation felt like shedding another layer of the social identity I'd constructed over decades of marriage. The days blended together without the punctuation marks of scheduled commitments or anticipated events. I woke when my body decided sleep was over, ate when hunger became impossible to ignore, went to bed when staying awake required more effort than closing my eyes. Time became elastic, measured not by clocks but by the changing quality of light through windows I rarely bothered to open. Marcus's voicemails grew more demanding as my availability decreased. "Mom, call me back. We need to discuss some practical matters. Mom, I'm concerned about you. Mrs. Patterson says she hasn't seen you in weeks. Mom, if you don't return my calls, I'm going to have to come over there and make sure you're all right." Mrs. Patterson, our elderly neighbor who'd appointed herself the neighborhood's informal monitor of unusual behavior. Of course she'd noticed my absence from the daily routines that marked normal suburban life. Of course she'd mentioned her observations to Marcus, providing him with additional evidence that I wasn't managing my grief in socially acceptable ways. When Marcus finally appeared at my door on a Tuesday afternoon, I almost didn't answer. But his knocking grew more insistent, and eventually I recognized the futility of pretending I wasn't home when my car sat in the driveway and Mrs. Patterson was probably watching from her kitchen window, ready to report on whatever drama was unfolding next door. "Mom," he said when I opened the door, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and exasperation. "I've been calling you for days." "I know," I said, stepping aside to let him enter the house he'd grown up in. The house that would someday belong to him unless he'd signed that away too. He walked through the rooms with the attention of someone cataloging changes, noting the newspapers stacked unread on the coffee table, the plants that were beginning to show signs of neglect, the general air of a house being occupied rather than lived in. "Are you eating?" he asked, opening the refrigerator to find containers of yogurt and packages of frozen meals, the diet of someone who'd given up on the pleasure of food. "I'm fine, Marcus." "You're not fine. Look at this place. Look at yourself." He gestured at my appearance, and I realized I was wearing the same clothes I'd slept in, that my hair hadn't been styled in weeks, that I'd stopped performing the basic maintenance routines that signal participation in the social world. "I'm grieving," I said, using the word he'd expect to hear, the explanation that justified any amount of withdrawal or neglect. "This isn't grief, Mom. This is depression. This is giving up." He sat heavily on the couch, his expression shifting from irritation to something that might have been genuine concern. "Dad wouldn't want this for you. Dad." As if Richard's preferences still mattered, as if his opinions carried weight in decisions about my future after he'd already distributed my present to other people. "What your father wanted," I said carefully, "seems to have been quite different from what I thought he wanted." Marcus looked uncomfortable, shifting on the couch cushions that had once supported family movie nights and homework sessions, and conversations about his future that I'd assumed would include consideration for mine. "Mom, I know you're angry about the will, about Sarah, about all of it, but dwelling on it isn't going to change anything. Dad made his choices and now we have to live with them. We." There was that word again, the collective pronoun that somehow never seemed to include me in its consideration. "You're right," I said. "Your father made his choices. You made yours too. What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm finally understanding that everyone in my life made choices about my future except me. And now I need to figure out what my choices are." He studied my face as if trying to identify the source of a change he couldn't quite name. "What kind of choices?" "I don't know yet," I said, and for the first time in weeks, that felt like the beginning of an answer rather than an admission of defeat. Marcus left after extracting a promise that I'd return his calls, that I'd take better care of myself, that I'd consider seeing a doctor about what he was convinced was depression requiring medical intervention. But as I watched his car disappear down the street, I realized something had shifted during our conversation. I wasn't depressed. I was done with pretending that relationships built on deception deserved my continued loyalty, done with accepting other people's definitions of what my grief should look like and how long it should last. Done with allowing my son and his girlfriend to manage my emotional responses to their betrayal. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt something that wasn't sadness or anger or confusion. I felt curious about what might be possible for a woman who'd stopped trying to be the person everyone else needed her to be, but they didn't know what I had kept all along. The morning I found the letters, I'd been looking for something else entirely. Richard's death certificate, actually. Martin Webb needed another copy for some insurance paperwork that Marcus insisted couldn't wait any longer. I'd been putting off the search because going through Richard's personal effects felt like archaeology, digging through the remains of a life I'd thought I understood. His desk had always been off limits during our marriage, not because he was secretive, but because he was methodical. Every paper had its place, every file its purpose, and my occasional attempts to help with organization had only frustrated him. "I have a system," he'd say gently but firmly whenever I offered to sort through the accumulating documents. "I know where everything is." Apparently, his system included a locked drawer I'd never noticed before. The key was taped to the underside of the desk lamp, exactly where someone would put it if they wanted to hide something in plain sight, while ensuring they could access it quickly when needed. Inside the drawer, beneath insurance policies and tax returns I'd expected to find, was a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. My hands recognized the handwriting before my mind processed what I was seeing. My own script, younger and more optimistic, addressing envelopes to Richard Morrison at his college dormitory address. Letters I'd written during our courtship, when he was finishing his degree and I was working as a secretary in my hometown, saving money for our wedding and dreaming about the life we'd build together. Letters full of plans and promises and the kind of innocent love that believes honesty and commitment are sufficient foundations for happiness. I untied the ribbon with trembling fingers, surprised that the silk hadn't deteriorated after 45 years. The letters were arranged chronologically, and reading them felt like meeting a stranger who happened to share my name and my handwriting. I dreamed about our house again last night. I'd written in February 1979. The one with the big kitchen where we can have dinner parties and the garden where we'll grow tomatoes and maybe roses if I can figure out how to keep them alive. I know it sounds silly, but I can see us there so clearly. You reading the paper at the breakfast table while I make coffee, both of us getting older together in rooms that belong to us. Such faith in the future, such certainty that love was enough to create the security I'd never had growing up in apartments where the landlord's priorities determined whether we had heat in winter or repairs when things broke. "I've been thinking about what you said about building something permanent," another letter read, "about how our children will have the stability we both missed. I want that so much, Richard. I want to give them what my parents couldn't give me, a home that doesn't disappear when circumstances change." Reading these letters, I remembered the woman who'd written them. She'd been practical but hopeful, determined to create something lasting from whatever materials life offered. She'd believed that marriage was partnership, that building a family meant two people working toward shared goals, that love grew stronger when it was tested by ordinary difficulties and daily choices. When had I stopped being that woman? When had I started accepting Richard's decisions without question, deferring to his judgment about finances and future plans as if my opinions were suggestions rather than equal contributions to our shared life? The letters revealed something else. Richard had saved them not as sentimental keepsakes, but as evidence of promises made. In the margins of several letters, he'd written notes in pencil: kitchen remodel, 1985, garden project, 1987, retirement planning discussion, 1995. He'd been tracking my dreams like items on a to-do list, checking off accomplishments as they were achieved, but some dreams had remained unmarked, and reading about them now felt like discovering artifacts from an abandoned civilization. The travel we'd planned, but never taken because there was always a more practical use for vacation money. The creative projects I'd mentioned, photography classes, genealogy research, maybe writing about my grandmother's immigration story, that had been postponed until someday when life was less demanding. At the bottom of the bundle was a letter I didn't remember writing, dated just 2 months before our wedding. "I know we haven't talked much about what happens if things don't work out the way we're planning. I don't want to be morbid, but I've seen what happens when people don't prepare for difficulties. My mother always said that a woman should have something of her own, something that can't be taken away no matter what circumstances arise. I've been saving money in a separate account. Not because I don't trust you, but because I want to contribute equally to our security. I want to be a partner, not a dependent." Maybe that sounds unfeminine or unromantic, but I think real love includes practical considerations. I stared at that letter for a long time, trying to remember the woman who'd written it. She'd understood something about independence that I'd somehow forgotten during 40 years of gradually surrendering financial autonomy to someone who'd seemed better equipped to handle complex decisions. The account she'd mentioned, I'd completely forgotten about it. A small savings account I'd opened in my own name during our engagement, funded by the portion of my secretary's salary I'd managed to save despite contributing to wedding expenses and the down payment on our first apartment. I'd intended it as emergency money, insurance against the kind of financial helplessness I'd watched destroy my mother's options when my father left. But after our marriage, Richard had taken over all financial management, consolidating our resources into joint accounts that he monitored with the professional attention he brought to his work. The separate account had seemed unnecessary, even slightly disloyal, when we were building a life together. I'd mentioned it once, suggesting we transfer the money into our shared savings, and Richard had agreed it made sense to simplify our banking. Except now, sitting in his study with 45-year-old letters spread across his desk, I realized I'd never actually closed that account. I'd simply stopped thinking about it, stopped receiving statements when I'd changed our address, and failed to update my contact information with the bank. The account had faded from my awareness like a childhood memory, present but inaccessible until something triggered its return. It took 3 phone calls to locate the account. The bank had been acquired twice since 1979, and my maiden name complicated the search. But eventually, a patient customer service representative found my file and explained that the account remained active, accumulating minimal interest for decades while I'd focused on joint finances and shared goals. "The current balance is $18,412, she said, and I nearly dropped the phone. $18,000. Money I'd saved and forgotten, grown through compound interest and time into an amount that wouldn't solve all my problems, but could provide options I hadn't known I possessed. Money that belonged entirely to me, earned by my own work, and saved through my own foresight, untouched by Richard's final redistribution of our shared assets. That afternoon, I drove to the bank and sat across from a young financial advisor who probably wondered why an older woman was crying over paperwork for a modest savings account. But those tears weren't from sadness. They were from recognition. The woman who'd opened that account had known something about self-protection that I'd spent 40 years forgetting. "I'd like to understand my options," I told the advisor. "This money has been sitting here for a very long time, and I need to know what's possible now." She was efficient and professional, explaining investment options and withdrawal procedures with the careful attention of someone trained to help people make important financial decisions. But what struck me wasn't the technical information. It was the way she spoke to me as if my choices mattered, as if I was capable of understanding complex concepts and making informed decisions about my own resources. When had I stopped expecting that kind of respect? When had I started accepting the assumption that financial decisions were too complicated for me to understand, too important to trust to my judgment? I left the bank with new account information and a deposit slip for the first transfer I'd made in my own name in 40 years. Not a large amount, just enough to open a checking account that would be mine alone, fed by money that predated my marriage and represented possibilities that existed independent of anyone else's planning. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and a legal pad, writing lists for the first time since Richard's diagnosis had consumed all my attention. Not to-do lists for household maintenance or medical appointments, but inventory lists. What did I actually need? What did I want? What was possible for a 68-year-old woman who just remembered she had options? The house felt different as I moved through it, making notes about rooms that were too large for one person, furniture that served no purpose beyond occupying space, possessions that represented other people's preferences rather than my own choices. Richard had chosen the heavy oak dining set because it looked substantial and prosperous. I preferred the small breakfast table where we'd actually eaten most of our meals, where conversation was easier and the scale felt human rather than impressive. I opened drawers and cabinets I hadn't examined in years, discovering accumulated possessions that told the story of a life lived according to expectations rather than desires. Wedding china we'd used only for holidays. Crystal glasses that required special care and provided no more satisfaction than everyday alternatives. Decorative objects that Richard had considered appropriate for our social status, but that I'd never particularly liked. For the first time in months, I felt curious about tomorrow. Not hopeful exactly. Hope implied expectation, and I'd learned to be suspicious of expectations, but curious about what might be possible when choices were made by someone who'd stopped trying to please people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to make decisions without consulting her preferences. The phone rang while I was making these lists, and Marcus's name appeared on the caller ID. I let it ring until it stopped, then returned to my inventory with something that felt like peace. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. For 40 years, I'd been asking the wrong questions. Instead of wondering what Richard wanted or what Marcus needed or what other people expected, I'd started asking what Elena might choose if she trusted herself to make decisions about her own life. The answers weren't dramatic or revolutionary. I wanted to live somewhere smaller, easier to maintain, designed for one person who could arrange furniture and choose paint colors without consulting anyone else's preferences. I wanted to travel, not to exotic destinations but to places that interested me. Small towns with historical societies and libraries where I could research family history, gardens open to the public where I could learn about plants I'd never had space to grow. I wanted to spend time with people who saw me as Elena rather than as Richard's widow or Marcus's mother or someone's auxiliary person. I wanted to wake up in the morning with plans that mattered to me, activities that engaged my mind, rather than simply filling time until the next obligation arose. Most of all, I wanted to stop apologizing for taking up space in a world where I'd apparently been considered optional for longer than I'd realized. The woman who'd written those letters in 1979 had understood something essential. Security came not from depending on other people's good intentions, but from maintaining the ability to make independent choices when those intentions proved unreliable. She'd saved money not because she distrusted love, but because she understood that love without respect was insufficient foundation for a life. I'd forgotten her wisdom, but she'd left me a gift that had grown in value while I wasn't paying attention. Now I had what she'd tried to give me, options that belonged to me alone, choices that couldn't be voided by someone else's changing priorities. The real estate agent arrived on a Tuesday morning, precisely on time, and carrying a leather portfolio that suggested she took her work seriously. Janet Morrison, no relation despite the shared surname, had been recommended by the bank's financial advisor as someone who specialized in helping older clients transition to more manageable living situations. These large family homes can become overwhelming, Janet said as we walked through rooms I'd been sharing with ghosts for months. The maintenance, the utility costs, all that space that's no longer being used for its original purpose. She was tactful about it, but I understood what she was really observing. A house designed for a family, now occupied by one woman who rattled around in it like the last pill in a medicine bottle. The market is very strong right now for properties in established neighborhoods, she continued, making notes on her tablet as we moved from room to room. Homes with character, mature landscaping, good bones. Young families are specifically looking for exactly this type of house. Young families. People who would fill these rooms with children's voices and dinner conversations, and the kind of purposeful activity that I'd once created here but could never reconstruct alone. I want to be clear about something, I said as we stood in the living room where Marcus had grown up, where Richard and I had hosted Christmas mornings and birthday parties and the ordinary celebrations that mark a life being lived. I'm not selling because I'm forced to. I'm selling because I choose to. Janet nodded as if this distinction mattered to her, though I suspected she'd heard similar statements from other clients who needed to frame downsizing as empowerment rather than surrender. That's the best situation, she agreed. When you're selling from a position of choice rather than necessity, you can be more selective about timing and offers. You can wait for the right buyer at the right price. After she left, I called Marcus, not to ask permission or seek advice, but to inform him of decisions I'd already made. It felt strange to approach a conversation with my son as information delivery rather than negotiation, but liberating in a way that surprised me. You're selling the house? His voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd been caught off guard by news that affected his assumptions about the future. I am. Mom, don't you think this is something we should have discussed? It's a major decision. You're still grieving, still adjusting. Maybe you should wait until you're thinking more clearly. There it was again. The assumption that clarity was something that would come to me eventually, like a fever breaking, rather than something I'd already achieved through careful consideration of my actual circumstances. I am thinking clearly, Marcus. probably more clearly than I have in years. Where will you go? What's your plan? I'm looking at condominiums. Something smaller, easier to maintain. Something that belongs to me. The pause that followed felt loaded with calculations I couldn't see but could sense. Mom, you know the house will be mine eventually. We could work out some arrangement where you stay there and I help with the expenses, the upkeep. You don't have to leave. Mine eventually. Such casual assumption of inheritance, as if my continued presence in my own home was a temporary inconvenience to be managed until nature took its course and simplified everyone's situation. The house is mine now, Marcus, and I've decided to sell it. Another pause, longer this time. Does this have something to do with Dad's will? Are you doing this out of anger? This has to do with me finally making decisions based on what I want instead of what other people expect me to want. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Marcus promising to think about my decision as if his approval was required for me to proceed. But for the first time in months, his disapproval felt irrelevant to my planning. That afternoon, I drove to the part of town where new condominiums had been built specifically for people in transition, retirees downsizing, divorcees starting over, anyone who needed housing that offered independence without the burden of maintenance and yard work. Maple Ridge condominiums looked like a place where people came to begin again, rather than simply wait for endings. The buildings were modest but well-maintained, surrounded by professional landscaping that someone else would maintain. The sales office was staffed by a woman about my age, who'd clearly made similar transitions herself. I moved here 3 years ago after my husband died, she confided as we walked through the model unit. Best decision I ever made. Everything works, everything's new, and when something breaks, I call the management company instead of trying to find a repairman myself. The model unit was small but thoughtfully designed, with large windows that made the space feel open despite its compact size. The kitchen was modern and efficient, scaled for someone who cooked for pleasure rather than obligation. The bedroom was large enough for comfortable furniture, but small enough to feel cozy rather than echoing. What I love most, the saleswoman continued, is that I can lock the door and travel without worrying about anything. And the neighbors are wonderful. People who chose to be here, not people who ended up here by default. People who chose to be here. The phrase resonated with something I was just beginning to understand about the difference between circumstances that happened to you and circumstances you created for yourself. I filled out paperwork for a unit on the second floor, with windows that faced east toward morning light, and a small balcony where I could grow plants in containers without worrying about soil conditions or deer damage. The purchase would require most of my savings, both the rediscovered account and the modest inheritance Richard had left me after providing for Sarah's future, but it would be mine entirely. No shared mortgage with someone who could change the terms without consulting me. No property that carried the weight of other people's plans and expectations. Just a space that belonged to Elena, purchased with Elena's money, organized according to Elena's preferences. While the paperwork was being processed, I began the methodical process of sorting through 40 years of accumulated possessions, deciding what deserved space in my future and what belonged to the past I was consciously leaving behind. The process was surprisingly liberating. The formal dining room furniture that Richard had insisted we needed for entertaining went to an estate sale, along with the china cabinet and crystal glasses that had required special care for special occasions that had never felt particularly special to me. The king-size bedroom suite, too large for one person and too full of memories, was donated to a charity that helped families transitioning out of homelessness. What I kept surprised me. Not the expensive pieces that demonstrated our financial success, but the comfortable chair where I'd read novels on Sunday afternoons, the simple wooden table where I'd actually eaten most of my meals, the photographs that captured genuine moments rather than posed family portraits designed to project an image of happiness. Each decision felt like an act of self-definition. This matters to Elena. This brings Elena pleasure. This serves Elena's actual needs rather than someone else's expectations about what Elena should need. Marcus visited during the sorting process, ostensibly to help, but actually to monitor what was being discarded and what was being preserved. I watched him catalog items he apparently assumed would be part of his inheritance, and realized that even my possessions had been viewed as temporarily mine rather than permanently chosen. "Are you sure about the dining room set?" he asked as the estate sale workers loaded it into their truck. It's a really good piece. Solid wood, classic design. It could be worth a lot someday. Worth a lot to whom? I'd never enjoyed the formal meals we'd eaten at that table, preferring the intimacy of the breakfast nook where conversation was easier, and the scale felt human rather than impressive. I'm sure, I said. What about Dad's office furniture? His desk, the filing cabinets? There might be important papers still in there. I've been through everything, Marcus. What you need is in the box I set aside for you. He looked uncomfortable with my efficiency, my apparent ease at dismantling the environment he'd grown up in. It just seems like you're being hasty. These are big changes happening very quickly. These changes have been happening slowly for months, I corrected. I'm just finally acting on them. The day I received the call from Janet Morrison about an offer on the house, I was sitting on my back deck watching the garden Richard and I had planted together slowly return to wildness. The roses needed pruning, the vegetable patch was overgrown with weeds, and the fruit trees were dropping apples that no one would harvest. It's a good offer, Janet said. Actually, it's an excellent offer. The buyers saw the house yesterday and want to move quickly. They have cash, no financing contingencies, and they're willing to meet your asking price. A young couple with 2 small children who'd fallen in love with the neighborhood, the mature trees, the sense of established community that had drawn Richard and me here 25 years earlier. They wanted to close within 30 days, eager to settle their children in time for the new school year. I'll accept, I said, the words feeling both momentous and inevitable. That evening, I called Marcus to inform him of the sale. His reaction was swift and sharp. Mom, you can't make this decision without talking to me. We need to discuss the implications, the timing, your long-term financial planning. The decision is made, Marcus. What about Dad's things? His office, his personal effects? I haven't had time to go through everything yet. Your father's important papers are already organized for you. Everything else will go with me or be disposed of as I see fit. Mom, you're not thinking rationally. Selling the house, moving to some condo complex, getting rid of everything that has family significance? This isn't like you. He was right about that last part. This wasn't like the Elena he'd grown accustomed to, the one who'd deferred to other people's judgment and accepted other people's definitions of what her life should look like. You're right, I said. This isn't like me. But maybe that's exactly the point. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and realized that for the first time in months, I felt completely calm. Not the numbness that had followed Richard's death, not the anger that had accompanied discovering his betrayal, but genuine peace with decisions that belonged entirely to me. Something was shifting, and I could feel momentum building toward revelations that would change everything. The careful structures that Marcus and Sarah had built around their secret life were about to encounter forces they hadn't anticipated, choices they couldn't control. They'd assumed I would remain forever frozen in the role of grateful widow, manageable mother, woman whose preferences were less important than their convenience. But Elena was disappearing, and in her place was someone they'd never met before, someone who'd stopped asking permission to make decisions about her own life. Tomorrow would bring conversations they weren't prepared for, confrontations they couldn't manage, consequences they'd never considered. But tonight, I sat in my kitchen and felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd finally remembered how to choose her own future. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks before the house sale was scheduled to close. Heavy cream-colored paper with the letterhead of a law firm I'd never heard of, addressed to me in formal language that suggested serious legal business. Inside, a notification that Sarah Mitchell had filed papers to contest Richard's will on the grounds that he'd lacked mental capacity during his final months, claiming his decisions had been made under duress and undue influence. She was requesting a court review of all asset distributions made during the period of his illness, seeking to have his gifts to her declared legally invalid. I read the letter 3 times before understanding struck me like lightning. Sarah was claiming that Richard's generosity toward her had been the result of diminished capacity rather than genuine affection. She was arguing that the man who'd given her $200,000 and lifetime use of our lake house had been manipulated into those decisions by someone who'd taken advantage of his vulnerable state. The someone, according to the legal documents, was me. Sarah Mitchell, the woman who'd been having an affair with my dying husband while I paid her salary, was claiming in court that I had unduly influenced him to make financial decisions that benefited her. She was simultaneously arguing that Richard's gifts to her were invalid, while positioning me as the predatory party who'd manipulated a dying man for financial gain. I called Martin Webb immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. "Elena," he said, when his secretary put me through, "I was about to call you. We need to discuss this legal filing. It's unusual." "Unusual how?" "Sarah is claiming that Richard was coerced into making provisions for her, but the evidence suggests exactly the opposite. She's also claiming that you were the one doing the coercing, which contradicts everything Richard told me about his motivations for the changes." Martin's voice carried a weariness that suggested he'd dealt with similar family disputes before, but nothing quite this complicated. "Elena, there's something else you should know. Sarah's attorney contacted our office yesterday with a settlement offer. She's willing to drop the legal challenge in exchange for the immediate transfer of the lake house deed and an additional cash payment of $50,000. A settlement offer. She was using the legal system to extort additional money from Richard's estate, threatening expensive litigation unless I agreed to pay her to go away quietly. "She's blackmailing me," I said. "Legally, it's called a settlement negotiation," Martin replied carefully. "But yes, the effect is similar. The threat of prolonged legal proceedings, the suggestion that fighting the claim would cost more than settling it, the implication that publicity might be damaging to your reputation." That afternoon, Marcus arrived at my house without calling first, his face grim with the expression of someone who'd been forced to deal with unpleasant complications. "Mom, we need to talk about this legal situation," he said, settling into the living room chair he'd occupied for similar difficult conversations over the past months. "Yes, we do. Sarah's attorney contacted me directly. They wanted me to know about the settlement offer, and they wanted to make sure I understood the implications of fighting versus settling." I studied my son's face, noting the careful neutrality of his expression, the way he was avoiding direct eye contact while delivering information that should have outraged him. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them I'd discuss it with you and get back to them with our family's response." Our family's response. As if this was a collective decision rather than an attack on me personally. As if Marcus was a neutral mediator rather than someone with obvious conflicts of interest. "Marcus," I said carefully, "the woman who's threatening to sue me is the same woman you're sleeping with. Don't you think that creates some complications in terms of whose interest you're representing?" His composed expression faltered slightly. "Mom, this isn't about my relationship with Sarah. This is about resolving a legal problem efficiently and moving forward. Your relationship with Sarah is the legal problem, Marcus. She's claiming I manipulated your father into making decisions that benefited her. But we both know the truth is exactly the opposite. The truth is that Dad made some questionable choices during a very difficult period," Marcus said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining things to people he considered incapable of understanding complexity. Whether those choices were the result of illness, medication, or influence from various people isn't really the point. The point is resolving this situation without expensive litigation that will hurt everyone involved. Various people. Such careful language to avoid acknowledging that the person who'd actually influenced Richard's decisions was sitting in front of me, trying to convince me to pay his girlfriend to make her false accusations disappear. "I'm not settling," I said. Marcus leaned forward, his patience apparently strained by my unreasonableness. "Mom, think about this practically. Fighting the claim will cost tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, drag on for months or years, and require you to justify every interaction you had with Dad during his final months. Even if you win, you'll have spent more money defending yourself than it would cost to just settle and be done with it. And if I settle, I'm admitting that I manipulated my dying husband for financial gain. You're not admitting anything. Settlement agreements specifically state that payment doesn't constitute admission of wrongdoing. You're just choosing the path that causes the least damage to everyone involved. Everyone involved." The phrase hung in the air between us, and I finally understood the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about Sarah securing additional money from Richard's estate. This was about Marcus positioning himself as the reasonable mediator while ensuring that his girlfriend received what she wanted without having to justify her claims in court. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest, "your father didn't leave me very much after providing for Sarah. My inheritance from 40 years of marriage is essentially the equity in this house, which I'm selling to buy a smaller place. If I pay Sarah $50,000 to drop her false accusations, I'll have nothing left for emergencies, nothing saved for healthcare costs, nothing to live on if Social Security isn't sufficient. Mom, you're being dramatic. You have resources, you have options, and if you ever need help, you know I'll— No. The word came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through his practiced reassurance. I don't know that, Marcus. What I know is that you've been lying to me for months, sleeping with my husband's caregiver while I paid her salary, helping her secure financial benefits from my marriage while pretending to support me through my grief. His composed expression finally cracked, revealing something that looked like genuine anger. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. Sarah and it developed naturally. We were both caring for Dad, both dealing with his illness, and we connected over shared experience. You connected while he was dying in the next room, Marcus. While I was working extra shifts to pay for his care, while I was trusting both of you to help me through the worst period of my life. We weren't hurting anyone. Our relationship didn't affect Dad's care or your situation. Our relationship affects my situation right now. She's threatening to destroy my reputation and drain my resources unless I pay her additional money, and you're advising me to comply rather than defending your mother against false accusations. Marcus stood up, his composure finally completely gone. Fine. You want me to choose sides? You want me to tell my girlfriend that my mother matters more than she does? That protecting your pride is more important than resolving this situation reasonably? I want you to tell the truth, Marcus. I want you to acknowledge that Sarah's claims are false, that I never manipulated your father, that his decisions about her were made without any input from me because I didn't even know about their relationship until after he was dead. And then what? We fight this in court for 2 years while lawyers get rich and our family destroys itself over money that won't matter to any of us when we're dead? This isn't about money, Marcus. This is about truth. This is about whether I'm going to allow myself to be branded as a woman who preyed on her sick husband because it's convenient for your girlfriend to frame the situation that way. Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Sarah doesn't want to hurt you. She just wants what Dad promised her, plus enough extra to compensate for the stress and expense of having to fight for it legally. What Dad promised her. As if promises made to a caregiver during an affair carried the same weight as 40 years of marriage vows. As if secret commitments made while I was excluded from financial decisions deserved equal consideration with my needs as his widow. Get out, I said quietly. Mom, get out of my house, Marcus. And don't come back until you're ready to tell me the truth about what happened during your father's final months, instead of trying to manage my response to being betrayed by everyone I trusted. After he left, I sat in my living room and felt something settle into place that I hadn't accessed in decades. Not anger. Anger was hot and reactive and eventually exhausting. This was something colder and more durable, something that felt like the emotional equivalent of steel. I called Martin Webb and told him to schedule a meeting with Sarah's attorney. Are you planning to settle? He asked. I'm planning to make them an offer they'll remember for a very long time, I said. That evening, for the first time since Richard's death, I slept deeply and dreamlessly. The peaceful rest of someone who'd finally stopped trying to preserve relationships that had never actually existed. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of defending myself against people who'd mistaken my previous compliance for permanent weakness. They were about to discover that the woman who'd quietly endured their betrayal and deception had been replaced by someone who'd remembered how to fight for herself. Someone who understood that dignity couldn't be settled out of court, that truth was worth defending regardless of the cost, and that some battles were worth having even when winning meant losing everything else. The Elena they'd known was gone. In her place was a woman who'd finally remembered that respect wasn't something you could earn through submission, but something you claimed by refusing to accept less than you deserved. The meeting with Sarah's attorney took place in Martin Webb's conference room on a gray October morning that felt appropriately somber for what I intended to be a funeral. Not mine, but the burial of any remaining illusions about the people I'd thought I could trust. Sarah arrived dressed in black, as if she were still in mourning, accompanied by a sharp-eyed lawyer who'd probably advised her that appearing vulnerable and grief-stricken would play better than projecting confidence. She avoided eye contact as we settled around the polished table, her hands folded in her lap like a penitent, rather than someone making accusations. Her attorney, David Crawford, opened a thick folder and began with the practiced sympathy of someone accustomed to handling delicate family disputes. We appreciate everyone's willingness to discuss resolution rather than pursuing lengthy litigation. These situations are always difficult, especially when grief and financial stress compound family tensions. Such careful language, designed to make Sarah's blackmail sound like unfortunate circumstance rather than calculated cruelty. My client's position is straightforward, Crawford continued. Mr. Morrison's mental capacity was significantly compromised during his final months, and his financial decisions during that period don't reflect his true intentions or his lifetime pattern of responsible money management. I watched Sarah's face as her lawyer essentially argued that the man who'd loved her enough to restructure his will had been incompetent to make that choice. She didn't flinch at hearing Richard described as mentally deficient, didn't protest the characterization that reduced their relationship to exploitation of a vulnerable person. Furthermore, Crawford said, we have reason to believe that undue influence was exercised by parties who had both opportunity and motivation to manipulate Mr. Morrison's decisions during his period of diminished capacity. Parties, plural. As if there had been multiple people working together to deceive a dying man rather than one woman who'd been completely excluded from decisions made without her knowledge. Martin Webb glanced at me, waiting for my response to accusations I'd spent weeks preparing to address. But instead of defending myself against charges we all knew were false, I did something Sarah's attorney hadn't expected. I smiled. Mr. Crawford, I said, before we discuss settlement terms, I'd like to share some information that might help clarify the situation. I opened my own folder and withdrew photocopies of documents I'd spent the past week organizing with the methodical precision Richard had taught me during 40 years of watching him prepare for important meetings. These are credit card statements from the account Richard used for personal expenses, I said, sliding copies across the table. As you can see, beginning in February of this year, he was making weekly cash advances of $500, always on Thursdays, always from the same ATM near the hospital where Sarah worked. Crawford glanced at the statements, his confident expression beginning to show signs of strain. These are copies of jewelry purchases Richard made during the same period, I continued, producing additional papers. A diamond tennis bracelet in March, pearl earrings in April, a sapphire pendant in May, all purchased from the same jewelry store, all charged to his personal credit card, all bought on days when I was working and Sarah was providing his care. Sarah had gone very pale, her hands no longer folded calmly but twisted together in her lap. This is Richard's cell phone records, I said, adding another set of documents to the growing pile. 247 calls to Sarah's personal number between January and June, many lasting over an hour, frequently placed late at night when I was sleeping in the guest room to avoid disturbing his rest. I paused to let the implications settle before continuing with the evidence I'd spent weeks collecting, the paper trail that told the story of a relationship that had been anything but professional. These are bank records showing that Richard opened a separate account in March, funded with transfers from our joint savings. The account was used exclusively for cash withdrawals that correspond exactly with the dates when Sarah reported to the hospice agency that she needed to purchase medical supplies for Richard's care. Crawford was no longer looking confident. Sarah was staring at her hands, possibly understanding for the first time that her months of careful deception had left traces that could be documented and verified. Finally, I said, producing the last set of documents, these are the original drafts of Richard's revised will, with handwritten notes in his margins. As you can see, the changes weren't made during a period of diminished capacity. They were planned and revised over several months, with detailed instructions about how to structure gifts to Sarah in ways that would minimize tax consequences and maximize her financial benefit. I closed my folder and looked directly at Sarah for the first time since the meeting began. Your client wasn't the victim of a confused dying man, Mr. Crawford. She was the beneficiary of a deliberate, calculated plan to redirect marital assets to someone Richard had been having an affair with while his wife remained unaware of their relationship. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah's attorney reviewed the documents I'd provided, his expression shifting from confidence to concern to something approaching panic as he realized his client had built her case on claims that could be definitively disproven. Mrs. Morrison, Crawford said finally, this information, some of this is quite personal. Are you prepared for the kind of scrutiny that litigation would bring to your marriage, your husband's final months, your family's private matters? It was a last attempt at intimidation, the suggestion that defending myself would require exposing details too painful or embarrassing to discuss publicly. But I'd spent months learning to distinguish between shame that belonged to me and shame that belonged to other people. "Mr. Crawford," I said, "my husband died loving someone else. My son chose to facilitate that relationship rather than protecting my interests. Your client accepted money and property from my marriage, while allowing me to believe she was simply providing professional care. If this goes to court, the scrutiny won't be on me." I stood up, gathering my documents with the same careful precision I'd used to organize them. I'm not settling. If Sarah wants to pursue her claims, she can do so, but she should understand that I have documentation of every lie she told, every boundary she crossed, and every dollar she extracted from my marriage while I paid her salary. "Mrs. Morrison," Crawford said quickly, "surely we can reach some accommodation that serves everyone's interests." "Everyone's interests were served when Richard's will was executed exactly as he intended," I replied. "Sarah received what he wanted her to have. If she believes she deserves more, she can make that case in court, where the evidence I've collected will be part of the public record." I turned to Sarah, who still hadn't spoken during the entire meeting. "I know you're probably wondering how I found all this information," I said. "The truth is, Richard kept meticulous records of everything. Every purchase, every transfer, every decision was documented with the same attention to detail he brought to his professional work. He wasn't hiding the affair from me because he was ashamed of it. He was hiding it because he knew it would hurt me, and he preferred to let me discover the truth after he was dead, rather than have that conversation while he was alive." Sarah finally looked up, her eyes bright with tears that might have been genuine. "Elena, I never meant for it to happen this way." "I know," I said, and realized I actually meant it. "But intentions don't matter as much as choices, Sarah. And you chose to take what wasn't offered to you while allowing me to pay for the privilege of being deceived." I left the conference room knowing that Sarah would withdraw her legal challenge within the week. Crawford would advise her that pursuing claims contradicted by documented evidence would result in sanctions, legal fees that would exceed any possible settlement, and public humiliation that would follow her for years. Marcus called that evening, his voice carrying a defeated quality I'd never heard before. "Mom, Sarah's dropping the lawsuit." "I know. Her attorney said you have evidence that proves things happened differently than she claimed." "I have evidence that proves exactly what happened, Marcus. No more, no less." A long pause. "Are you going to use any of that information against me?" The question revealed more about his character than any answer I could give. Even now, facing the consequences of his choices, he was primarily concerned with protecting himself rather than acknowledging the harm he'd caused. "I'm not going to use anything against you, Marcus. I'm going to move to my new home, live my own life, and let you build whatever relationship you want with Sarah. But I'm also not going to pretend that what happened was acceptable or that our relationship can continue as if it never occurred." "What does that mean?" "It means you're welcome to visit me if you'd like to have an honest conversation about what you did and why you did it. But I'm not interested in maintaining the pretense that we're a close family when you've demonstrated that my well-being is less important to you than your convenience." "Mom, I know I made mistakes. I know the timing was terrible. The situation was complicated. But I never meant to hurt you." There was that word again. Meant. As if intentions somehow neutralized consequences. As if the damage caused by thoughtless actions was less real than the damage caused by deliberate cruelty. "Goodbye, Marcus," I said, and hung up before he could offer additional explanations that would change nothing. 3 months later, I was sitting on the balcony of my new condominium, drinking morning coffee while watching birds visit the feeders I'd hung outside my kitchen window. The space was small but perfectly suited to someone who'd finally learned to distinguish between what she needed and what other people expected her to want. The moving process had been surprisingly liberating. Every possession I'd chosen to keep served a specific purpose or brought genuine pleasure. Every item I'd discarded had carried weight that belonged to someone else's vision of my life, rather than my own preferences. My neighbors were people who'd also chosen to be there, rather than people who'd ended up there by default. The woman next door was a retired teacher who spent her mornings reading on her balcony before volunteering at the literacy center. The couple across the hall had moved there after their children graduated, eager to travel without worrying about house maintenance. Everyone was friendly without being intrusive, present without being demanding. I'd started taking photography classes at the community college, something I'd mentioned in those long-ago letters to Richard but had never pursued because there always seemed to be more practical demands on my time and energy. My instructor was encouraging about my work, suggesting I had an eye for composition that could be developed with practice and study. I was also researching my grandmother's immigration story, using resources I'd never had time to explore when my days were structured around other people's schedules and needs. The local historical society had welcomed my volunteer help with their genealogy project, connecting me with other people who understood that family stories mattered, even when the families themselves had scattered or changed. Some evenings, I missed the illusion of companionship that marriage had provided, the sense of shared purpose that came from building something with another person. But I didn't miss the gradual erosion of self that had accompanied trying to be the woman Richard wanted, rather than the woman I actually was. Marcus had called twice since our final conversation, leaving messages that I hadn't returned. Not from cruelty, but from recognition that some relationships couldn't be repaired without one person accepting responsibility they weren't prepared to claim. He wanted forgiveness that restored the previous dynamic, rather than acknowledgement that transformed the relationship into something honest. The lake house, which Sarah now owned, had been put up for sale according to a mutual acquaintance who'd seen the listing. Apparently, maintaining a property designed for couples required more effort than Sarah had anticipated. She and Marcus were living together in an apartment across town, building a life funded partially by my husband's generosity and partially by their own efforts to create something sustainable. I wished them well, though I doubted their foundation was strong enough to survive the kind of testing that long-term relationships eventually required. People who begin relationships through betrayal often discover that trust is easier to lose than to rebuild, that patterns of deception have ways of recurring when new stresses arise. But their future wasn't my responsibility to predict or prevent. I'd spent enough years trying to manage other people's choices and their consequences. The woman in those 45-year-old letters had understood something I'd forgotten. Security came not from depending on other people's good intentions, but from maintaining the ability to make independent choices when those intentions proved insufficient. She'd saved money not because she distrusted love, but because she understood that love without respect was an inadequate foundation for a life. Now, sitting in my own space, surrounded by possessions I'd chosen and activities that engaged my interests, I felt connected to that younger woman in ways that transcended time. She'd given me exactly what I'd needed when everything else fell apart, the resources to remember who I was before I became who everyone else needed me to be. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't confrontation, but transformation. Sometimes the best revenge is living well enough to remember why your life matters, regardless of whether anyone else recognizes its value. I was 68 years old, and for the first time in decades, I was exactly where I belonged.